Our gospel reading for this morning comes not from the lectionary as we so typically do, but is another one of those times when we're using the passage for the Renew groups. Throughout the spring, winter and spring, we are using the reading for that month in the Renew group as the reading for the first Sunday of the month. And so we shift gears and go back to the Sermon on the Mount. The reading we're about to hear is a small portion of that and comes from early in the Sermon on the Mount, right after the Beatitudes. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all the home. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As I mentioned, today's reading is a small portion of the so-called Sermon on the Mount, although I'm not sure that's the best title for it. Jesus is not preaching. Jesus is teaching. Matthew sets the scene this way. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, and what follows is the Beatitudes, and then the verses we just heard, and then a great deal more afterwards. Jesus is teaching his disciples, but they're not the only ones to hear. There's also the crowd. Jesus isn't speaking directly to them, but they overhear as well. I wonder, do they think that Jesus is speaking to them as they listen in? Now, the crowd they're not disciples. They're not followers of Jesus. They're curious. They're intrigued. Perhaps they hope Jesus will cure some ailment or malady or help them in some other way. They're on the edge. Unlike the disciples gathered around Jesus, they're standing at the very back of the sanctuary, one foot still in the narthex. And it's not at all clear what, if anything, will come of their encounter with Jesus. Jesus has just finished offering his list of blessings, of those God favors: the poor in spirit, the meek and the merciful, those who mourn, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted. And then with the last blessing, Jesus shifts the formula from blessed are to blessed are you. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and speak all manner of evil against you because of me. And then Jesus says, after all, that's what they did to the prophets. Then in the verses that we just heard, Jesus really doubles down on this word you. You are the salt of the earth. But our translation doesn't really quite pick up the force of that. Jesus literally employs a double you here. And perhaps a better way to render it in English is to say, you are the ones who are the salt of the earth. You are the ones who are the light of the world. All the yous here are plural, by the way. You all are the ones. You guys are the ones. And obviously the disciples sitting right there with Jesus hear this, but so do the crowds. So do those listening in from the edges, those still out in the narthex, those thinking about maybe bringing a child to vacation Bible school, those who like Christianity and the idea of Jesus, but aren't really engaged in any sort of mission or ministry. What about them? Is Jesus speaking to them too? Salt of the earth. Salt doesn't have nearly the same importance in our day as it would have for those first people who heard Jesus speak. Salt for us is cheap, it's mundane, it's ubiquitous. Some of us have way too much of it. As doctors tell some of us, you need to cut back on your salt. But in Jesus' day, salt was much more than a seasoning. It was extremely valuable and it was essential. Salt was the only reliable way of preserving food in Jesus' day. Salt was one of the things the Old Testament commanded for Israel to bring as offerings to God. Salt was associated with purification and with life. You are the salt of the earth speaks of something that is crucial and essential and life-giving. Salt of the earth. Of the earth. Of course, of the earth. That's where we are. Except that I wonder if perhaps Jesus is saying something more here. In just a few verses more in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will teach that model prayer that's the basis of what we call the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. None of the people listening to Jesus, the disciples right next to him or the folks out in the narthex, think the kingdom of heaven has anything to do with going to heaven when you die. The kingdom is about things being made new, things being transformed. The kingdom is when God's will is done on earth, when earth starts to look like heaven. The late Mississippi comedian Jerry Clower once said, "Some people are so heavenly minded, they ain't no earthly good." And that's because a lot of folks somehow got the idea that Christian faith is primarily about getting on God's invitation list. But Jesus says it's about becoming his disciples. It is about becoming those whose life and living and whose work somehow reveals life and light to the earth and to the world. salt to the earth, light to the world. And these must have been powerful words of encouragement to Peter and James and John and the other disciples. You may think you're just simple fishermen. You may think you're not all that important, but you are the ones who will show the earth what it was created for. You are the ones who will help the people of the world understand how they were created to live. You are the ones who will help transform the world. Peter and James and John hear Jesus speak, but so do the people in the narthex. And the people thinking about bringing a child to vacation Bible school, and the people who just happened by that day for who knows what reason. Jesus wants to make it clear exactly what it means to be a part of this movement that he is starting. He wants people to know whether they're disciples or whether they may someday become one. The people listening to Jesus, both then and now, are a mixed bag of disciples and crowd, of followers and considerers. And Jesus says to all of them what it means to be his followers. Maybe most of us are in the disciple crowd, the disciple group. At least that's what we say. We've made that announcement. But, you know, we say and repeat a lot of things in church without taking much time to consider what it is we're actually saying. Like when people join the church and make their profession of faith, answering this question: will you be Christ's faithful disciple, obeying his word and showing his love? Whenever it is that we're really ready to say yes, Jesus says to us, you, yes, you are the ones. You are the ones. You may think you're too old or too young. You may think you're not smart enough or important enough. You may think you don't know enough or have enough power or influence. But you are the ones whose lives will show the earth what the kingdom looks like. You are the ones who will be salt, by whom I will bring life to the earth. You are the ones that I have chosen to help me transform the world. All praise and glory to the God who in Christ comes to us and invites us to join him in the work of the kingdom. Thanks be to God.
Praise to you and peace in the name of Christ, who has called us together to this place to be the community gathered